the allure of Mount Everest had always been irresistible to adventurers and thrill-seekers alike. Its towering peaks and treacherous slopes called to those with a thirst for challenge, a desire to conquer the unconquerable. For a group of 5 childhood friends from the United States, the dream of reaching the summit had been years in the making. They were young, between 25 and 35, full of energy and determination. This was the ultimate test of their courage, a journey that would push them to their limits. But as they began their ascent, they had no way of knowing that this mountain held far more than physical challenges. In the icy winds and the shadowy crevices of Everest, something far more sinister awaited them, something that would turn their dream into a nightmare. Only one of them would return to tell the tale. The journey to Everest's base camp had been filled with excitement and camaraderie. Alex, the leader of the group, had been the one to push the hardest for this trip. He was the oldest at 35, a seasoned climber who had conquered several peaks around the world. Then there was Ethan, 30, the jokester of the group, always ready with a quick quip to lighten the mood. Mike, 28, was the quiet one, thoughtful and introspective, but with a strength that belied his calm demeanor. Sarah, 27, was the only woman in the group, fierce and determined, her eyes always on the prize. And finally, there was Jake, 25, the youngest, full of energy and eager to prove himself. As they began their climb, the atmosphere was electric. The air was crisp, the snow beneath their boots crunching with each step. The vast, white landscape stretched out before them, majestic and imposing. The group moved steadily, their spirits high as they tackled the first leg of their journey. The mountain was challenging, but they had trained for this. They were ready, or so they thought. It wasn't long before they began to feel the effects of the altitude. The air grew thinner, each breath a little harder than the last. The cold seeped into their bones, the wind biting at their exposed skin. But they pressed on, driven by the thrill of the climb and the promise of reaching the summit. As they climbed higher, the landscape began to change. The once familiar white snow took on a bluish hue, and the sky seemed to darken, even though it was still early in the day. The mountain was transforming, becoming something else entirely. It was as if they had crossed into another world, a world where the rules of nature no longer applied. They paused for a break, huddling together for warmth and to catch their breath. It was then that Sarah noticed something strange. She pointed to a distant ridge, where the snow appeared to be moving, shifting as if alive. The others followed her gaze, but by the time they looked, whatever she had seen was gone. Alex brushed it off as a trick of the light, a mirage caused by the cold and the altitude. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they resumed their climb, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The wind howled around them, carrying with it strange, distant sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the very heart of the mountain. Mike was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The others nodded, their faces paled beneath their layers of gear. There was something out there, something they couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The mood shifted from excitement to unease as they continued their ascent. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the mountain itself was trying to communicate with them. The once friendly banter had faded, replaced by a tense silence. Each step felt heavier, as if they were being weighed down by an invisible force. And then, without warning, Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes were wide with fear as he pointed ahead, where a dark figure stood silhouetted against the snow. It was too far to make out any details, but there was no mistaking the fact that it was watching them. The group froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was enough to send a chill down their spines. The figure on the ridge remained motionless, its dark outline stark against the white snow. The group stared, unsure of what to do. Alex, ever the leader, finally broke the silence. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice firm but laced with unease. "It's probably just another climber." But deep down, he knew something was off. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't signaled, hadn't shown any sign of being another human being. And yet, they couldn't just stand there, frozen in fear. With a reluctant nod from the others, they resumed their climb, their eyes darting back to the ridge every few seconds. But as they trudged forward, the figure seemed to vanish into the swirling snow, leaving them with only the unsettling feeling that they were not alone on this mountain. The higher they climbed, the more the atmosphere around them changed. The wind picked up, howling like a living thing, whipping snow into their faces and obscuring their vision. The temperature plummeted, and the once steady, rhythmic crunch of their boots on the snow became labored and uneven. The mountain, it seemed, was growing more hostile with every step. The whispers that had plagued them earlier returned, louder and more distinct. They were no longer just vague sounds carried by the wind, they were voices, murmuring in a language none of them could understand. The voices seemed to be coming from all around them, from the very walls of the mountain itself. Sarah, who had been the first to sense something was wrong, was now visibly shaken. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. "I don't like this," she whispered, barely audible over the wind. "Something's not right here." Mike, usually the calmest of the group, was also starting to show signs of strain. "We should turn back," he suggested, his voice tight with fear. "This doesn't feel right." But Alex was determined to press on. "We've come too far to turn back now," he insisted, though even he could feel the dread creeping in. He didn't want to admit it, but the mountain was beginning to feel like a living entity, one that didn't want them there. As they continued their ascent, the landscape around them grew more surreal. The snow, once pure white, now had streaks of dark, almost black, running through it. The air was thick with a strange, metallic scent that made their skin crawl. And the light, what little there was, seemed to shift and warp, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered at the edges of their vision. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, it was just a slight vibration, barely noticeable. But within seconds, it escalated into a full-blown tremor, shaking the very foundation of the mountain. The group huddled together, trying to keep their balance as the snow and ice beneath them shifted and cracked. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the mountain itself was crying out in anger. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremor stopped. The mountain was silent once more, but the damage had been done. A massive crack had appeared in the snow just ahead of them, splitting the path in two. On the other side, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood another dark figure. But this one was closer, and it was moving, slowly, deliberately, towards them. Panic set in as the group realized they were trapped. The path behind them had already begun to collapse, leaving them with nowhere to go but forward, towards the figure that was now unmistakably human, or at least, had been at some point. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was being controlled by some unseen force. And those eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with a malevolent energy, bore into them as it approached. The figure moved closer with each passing second, and the group could feel the tension in the air thickening around them. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but the path was blocked by the gaping crack in the snow, and the only way forward was toward the approaching figure. It was no longer possible to deny that something was terribly wrong on this mountain and that they were far from alone. Alex's resolve, which had been so strong at the start of their journey, was beginning to crumble. He looked at his friends, their faces pale with fear, and knew they were all thinking the same thing: they had to find a way out. But the mountain seemed to have other plans. The wind howled louder, almost drowning out the strange whispers that still lingered in the air. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the figure drew closer, its features became clearer, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The figure, once human, was now something else entirely. Its skin was stretched tight over a skeletal frame, its eyes dark and sunken, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. It was like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings, its head lolling to one side as it moved with an eerie, mechanical precision. Sarah clutched at Alex's arm, her voice trembling with fear as she whispered, "What is that?" But Alex had no answer. He could only stare in horror as the figure came to a stop just a few feet away from them, its hollow eyes locked onto theirs. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the malevolence radiating from it was palpable. Ethan, who had always been the joker of the group, was now frozen in place, his usual bravado gone. He took a step back, his foot slipping on the icy ground, and he nearly fell into the crack that had split the path. Mike reached out to steady him, but his hand was trembling, the fear in his eyes betraying the calm facade he was trying to maintain. They were all scared, more scared than they had ever been in their lives, and the realization that they might not make it off this mountain alive was beginning to sink in. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching them with those dark, hollow eyes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging the group to do something, anything, to break the standoff. But they were paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think of what to do next. The mountain was closing in around them, its icy grip tightening with every passing second, and the path to safety seemed to slip further and further away. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward, its movements sudden and violent. The group scattered, scrambling to get out of its way, but there was nowhere to go. Alex felt a cold hand grab his arm, its grip like iron, and he cried out in pain as he was pulled toward the edge of the crack. The others watched in horror as the figure dragged him closer and closer to the abyss, its hollow eyes gleaming with a malevolent glee. In a desperate bid for survival, Sarah threw herself at the figure, her hands clawing at its face, trying to force it to release Alex. The figure snarled, its voice a guttural growl that sent chills down their spines, but it didn't let go. The mountain seemed to roar in response, the wind whipping around them with a fury that matched the intensity of the struggle. And then, just as it seemed Alex would be lost to the darkness below, the figure released him and disappeared into the shadows. The Lake of Horror. Lake Louise, with its striking emerald waters and breathtaking mountain backdrop, is a destination that draws tourists from around the world. Among them was a group of Indian tourists, eager to experience the natural beauty of Canada's famed lake. The day had started like any other, a guided tour, awe-inspiring views, and a sense of adventure in the air. But as the group ventured further from the main path, they lost sight of their guide. What began as a simple hike quickly turned into a harrowing journey as they stumbled upon a hidden cave nestled in the mountains. Inside, they found more than just the lake's water. The darkness concealed creatures beyond their worst nightmares, and the serene beauty of Lake Louise became a horrifying trap from which escape seemed impossible. The morning sun bathed Lake Louise in a warm, golden light, making the green waters shimmer like a jewel. The group of Indian tourists was captivated by the sight, their cameras clicking as they tried to capture the beauty of the scene. Led by an experienced guide, they marveled at the towering peaks and the pristine environment that surrounded them. It was a day that promised nothing but peace and natural wonder. But as the group moved further along the trail, the terrain grew steeper, and the paths became less defined. The guide led them through a dense thicket of trees, promising a view from a higher vantage point, but the thick canopy above soon blocked out the sun, casting the trail in shadow. The laughter and chatter of the group faded as they realized the guide was no longer in sight. Panic began to set in as they called out, their voices echoing off the mountains with no reply. The sense of adventure that had filled them earlier was quickly replaced by a growing unease. They were alone in a vast, unfamiliar landscape, with no clear path back to safety. One of the tourists, a young man named Raj, suggested they climb the nearby mountains to get a better view and hopefully spot the guide from above. The others agreed, desperate to find a way out of their predicament. They began their ascent, the steep incline challenging their stamina and resolve. The higher they climbed, the more the landscape changed. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks and patches of snow that hadn't yet melted under the summer sun. The air grew colder, and the wind whipped around them, carrying with it a faint, unsettling sound that none of them could place. As they reached a plateau, they paused to catch their breath. The lake, once so beautiful, now looked distant and eerie from their new perspective. It was then that Priya, one of the women in the group, noticed something strange, a dark opening in the side of the mountain, almost hidden by the shadows cast by the rocks. It was a cave, its entrance wide enough to suggest it led deep into the mountain. Curiosity and desperation drove them closer. The group huddled at the entrance, peering into the darkness. The air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been, and it carried a damp, musty smell that made their stomachs turn. Raj, always the boldest of the group, suggested they explore the cave. Maybe, he reasoned, the guide had taken shelter there, or perhaps it could lead them back to the main trail. Despite their better judgment, the group agreed, driven by the hope that the cave might offer a way out of their growing nightmare. Armed with their phone flashlights, they stepped into the cave, the light barely penetrating the thick darkness that enveloped them. The walls were slick with moisture, and the sound of dripping water echoed eerily through the cavern. The deeper they went, the more the unease in their chests grew, tightening like a vice. As they ventured further into the cave, they realized the ground beneath them was no longer solid rock but wet and spongy, like the earth had been saturated with water. And then they saw it, a pool of water, the same deep green as the lake outside, but something was off. The water was too still, too perfect, as if it were hiding something beneath its surface. The sight of the still, green water in the cave sent a shiver down Raj's spine. It was as if the pool was waiting for something, or someone. The group stood at the edge, their flashlight beams skimming over the surface but unable to penetrate the dark depths below. The water was unnaturally calm, undisturbed by the droplets that occasionally fell from the ceiling. Priya took a step back, her unease growing with each passing second. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded in silent agreement, but their curiosity, mixed with fear, kept them rooted to the spot. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and the musty smell intensified, making it hard to breathe. Raj, trying to shake off the fear that gripped him, knelt by the edge of the pool, dipping his fingers into the water. It was icy cold, much colder than the lake outside, and as he pulled his hand back, he noticed something strange, a faint, greenish glow emanating from the depths. The light pulsed softly, like the heartbeat of something lurking far below. He frowned, wiping his hand on his jacket. "There's something down there," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. His words hung in the air, thick with tension. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the fear in their eyes reflecting the growing sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. Before they could react, a ripple appeared on the surface of the water, spreading outward in slow, concentric circles. The group froze, their eyes locked on the pool as the ripple grew larger, more pronounced. The greenish glow intensified, casting an eerie light on the walls of the cave. It was then that they realized they weren't alone. A shape began to emerge from the depths, slowly rising toward the surface. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct and formless, but as it drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary creature. The water seemed to part for it, revealing a mass of writhing tendrils, each one glistening with a slick, dark fluid. The tendrils twisted and coiled, moving with a disturbing, unnatural grace. The group recoiled in horror, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their feet refused to move. They were paralyzed by fear, their eyes locked on the monstrous form that was now fully visible. The creature's body was long and serpentine, its skin a sickly shade of green that matched the water. Dozens of eyes, cold and lifeless, dotted its face, each one focusing on a different member of the group. And then, as if sensing their terror, the creature opened its mouth, revealing row upon row of sharp, needle-like teeth. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, echoing through the cave like the growl of a predator about to strike. The water around it began to churn, splashing against the walls as the creature moved closer to the edge of the pool. Priya was the first to snap out of her trance. With a strangled cry, she turned and bolted for the cave entrance, her footsteps echoing off the walls. The others followed suit, their fear propelling them forward as they scrambled to escape. But the cave seemed to close in around them, the darkness growing thicker, the air more oppressive. The sound of the creature's movements grew louder, more frenzied, as if it was giving chase. Just as they reached the mouth of the cave, Raj dared to glance back, and what he saw nearly made him collapse in terror. The creature had pulled itself halfway out of the pool, its tendrils stretching toward them, writhing and snapping in the air. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, and its mouth was open wide, ready to devour anything in its path. Raj's heart pounded in his chest as he tore his eyes away from the monstrous creature and sprinted toward the cave's entrance. The others were right behind him, their panicked breaths echoing through the narrow passage. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around them, the darkness growing thicker with each passing second. The only light came from their flickering flashlights, casting erratic shadows that danced on the stone. They reached the entrance, gasping for air as they stumbled out into the cold mountain air. But the relief was short-lived. The sky had darkened, and a thick fog had rolled in, obscuring their view of the lake below. It was as if the mountain itself was conspiring to trap them, to prevent their escape. The path that had led them up was now shrouded in mist, the way back hidden from sight. Raj turned to face the cave, his mind racing. The creature was still in there, lurking in the shadows, but he knew it wouldn't stay hidden for long. They needed to find the guide, to get back to safety before it was too late. But as he looked at his friends, their faces pale with fear, he realized that the terror of what they had seen was already taking its toll. Priya was shaking, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. But there was no clear path, no way to know which direction would lead them to safety. The fog was too thick, the landscape unfamiliar. They were lost, trapped on a mountain that had become a nightmare. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The tremor was subtle at first, just a slight vibration underfoot, but it quickly grew into a violent shaking that knocked them off their feet. The mountain rumbled with a deep, guttural sound, as if it were alive and angry. Raj scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as he tried to regain his balance. The cave entrance loomed behind him, a gaping maw that seemed to pulse with the same eerie green light as the water inside. Then, without warning, the creature emerged from the cave, its massive form silhouetted against the dark sky. It was even larger than they had realized, its serpentine body twisting and coiling as it slithered out into the open. The tendrils that had been snapping in the air now reached out toward them, each one tipped with a sharp, barbed point that glistened with a dark, oily substance. The group froze in terror, unable to tear their eyes away from the creature. It moved with a deliberate, almost graceful motion, its eyes locking onto each of them in turn. The whispers that had haunted them earlier returned, louder and more insistent, as if the mountain itself was speaking through the creature, urging it to strike. Raj knew they couldn't outrun it. The creature was too fast, too powerful, and the mountain offered no cover, no place to hide. They were at the mercy of a force they couldn't understand, and it was closing in on them with every passing second. He glanced at his friends, his mind racing for a plan, but there was nothing, no escape, no way out. The creature was upon them, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare them, to drag them back into the darkness. In a last, desperate act of defiance, Raj grabbed a loose rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature. It struck the beast's side with a dull thud, but the creature barely flinched. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as it focused on Raj. The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his leg with a vice-like grip. Raj screamed as the barbs dug into his flesh, the oily substance burning like acid. The others watched in horror as Raj was pulled toward the creature, his screams echoing through the night. Priya lunged forward, trying to grab his hand, but it was too late. The creature's tendrils tightened their grip, and with a powerful yank, it dragged Raj back into the cave. His screams were cut off as the darkness swallowed him whole, leaving the others standing in stunned silence, their minds unable to process what had just happened. The Flatwoods Monster. The Appalachian Mountains have long been a place of mystery and fear, known for their eerie beauty and the legends that surround them. One of the most terrifying tales to emerge from these mountains is that of the Flatwoods Monster. For boys, Edward, Eddie, Nolan, and Tommy had heard the stories but never believed them. They spent their days playing in the fields, free from the worries of the world. But one day, curiosity led them deeper into the mountains, to a place where the shadows seemed darker and the air colder. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a terror so profound that it defied explanation. This is the story of how an innocent adventure turned into a nightmare, a tale that remains shrouded in mystery to this day. The sun was beginning to set over the Appalachian Mountains, casting long shadows across the fields where Edward, Eddie, Nolan, and Tommy were playing. The boys were full of energy, their laughter echoing through the valley as they chased each other through the tall grass. It was a perfect evening, The kind that made them forget about the strange stories they had heard from the old folks in town, stories about strange creatures that roamed the mountains at night, unseen and unknown. Edward, the oldest and the natural leader of the group, suddenly stopped and pointed towards the mountains. "Let's go up there," he suggested, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. The others hesitated, their parents' warnings echoing in their minds. But the thrill of adventure was too strong, and one by one, they nodded in agreement. The boys made their way toward the base of the mountain, the excitement growing with each step. The air grew cooler as they approached, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across their path. The laughter that had filled the air just moments before was now replaced by a tense silence, each boy lost in his own thoughts, wondering if they had made the right decision. As they began to climb, the terrain became rougher, the trees denser. The trail, once clear and easy to follow, seemed to disappear beneath their feet, forcing them to push through the underbrush. The deeper they went, the more the light faded, the sun dipping below the horizon and leaving them in the twilight of the coming night. Nolan was the first to speak, his voice shaky. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested, glancing nervously at the shadows that seemed to move just beyond their vision. But Edward, determined to prove his bravery, shook his head. "We've come this far. Let's just see what's up ahead," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. They continued on, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each step. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and creating an unsettling symphony of sounds. The boys couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though none of them dared to say it aloud. The stories they had heard about the Flatwoods Monster, once a source of amusement, now loomed large in their minds. As they reached a small clearing, they paused to catch their breath. The trees around them were thick, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out what little light remained. It was then that Eddie noticed something strange, a foul smell, like sulfur, hanging heavy in the air. He wrinkled his nose and looked around, but there was no obvious source for the stench. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. The air was thick with the smell, so strong it made their eyes water. Suddenly, a low humming sound began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. The boys looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. Before they could react, a bright light filled the clearing, blinding them with its intensity. The boys shielded their eyes, stumbling backward as the light seemed to pulse and grow, bathing the entire area in an otherworldly glow. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving the boys standing in the darkness, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the clearing was no longer empty. Standing before them, illuminated by the faint light of the moon, was a figure unlike anything they had ever seen. The figure before them was like nothing they had ever seen. It stood tall, towering over the boys, its body shrouded in a dark, metallic sheen that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its head was large and oval-shaped, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness, locking onto the boys with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. The air around the figure seemed to shimmer, distorting the space like heat waves on a summer day. Edward, usually the bravest of the group, found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but his body refused to obey his mind's desperate commands to run. The others were equally frozen, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the creature that had appeared out of nowhere. The humming sound that had filled the clearing moments before returned, but now it was different, deeper, more resonant, as if coming from within the creature itself. The ground beneath their feet vibrated with the sound, and the boys felt as though the very earth was coming alive, responding to the presence of this monstrous being. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that pressed down on them, making it hard to breathe. Eddie, the second oldest, managed to break free from his paralysis, his instincts screaming at him to get away. He grabbed Tommy's arm, shaking him hard. "We need to go, now," he whispered urgently, his voice trembling with fear. But Tommy, the youngest and smallest of the group, was too frightened to move. His eyes were locked on the creature, his face pale and expressionless, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Nolan, sensing the danger, tried to pull Tommy away, but the boy seemed to be in a trance, mesmerized by the creature's glowing red eyes. The light from those eyes pulsed rhythmically, in time with the deep hum that filled the clearing, and Nolan could feel it resonating in his chest, a vibration that seemed to reach into his very soul. The air around them crackled with electricity, and the scent of sulfur grew stronger, burning their throats and making their eyes water. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was studying them, assessing their reactions. Its eyes never wavered, locking onto each boy in turn, and with each glance, the fear that gripped them tightened, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. The humming grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to penetrate their very bones, vibrating through their bodies with an intensity that made their teeth chatter. Edward, finally shaking off the paralysis that had gripped him, knew they had to get out of there before it was too late. He glanced around, desperately searching for a way to escape, but the clearing was surrounded by dense trees and thick underbrush, making it impossible to run without being caught. The creature seemed to sense their desperation, its eyes narrowing as it took another step forward, closing the distance between them. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Edward turned and grabbed Nolan and Eddie by the shoulders, pushing them toward the trees. "Run," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Run now!" The command broke through the fog of fear that had clouded their minds, and the boys bolted toward the tree line, their hearts pounding as they scrambled through the underbrush. But Tommy, still frozen in place, was left behind. The creature's eyes locked onto him, and he let out a low, guttural sound that sent a wave of terror through the others. The sound was unnatural, a deep growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and filling the night air. Tommy's eyes widened, and for a moment, it looked as though he might snap out of his trance and run. But the creature moved faster than they could have imagined, its long, metallic limbs stretching out toward Tommy. The boys could only watch in horror as the creature's grip closed around him, pulling him closer as the light in its eyes grew brighter, blinding them with its intensity. The last thing they heard was Tommy's terrified scream, echoing through the trees as the creature disappeared into the darkness, taking him with it. The boys ran through the dense forest, branches scratching their faces and snagging their clothes as they fled the nightmare they had just witnessed. Edward led the way, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with fear and guilt. He had left Tommy behind, his youngest friend, taken by that thing, that creature from the dark. The image of Tommy being pulled into the shadows, his scream piercing the night, played over and over in his mind, driving him forward even as exhaustion began to take its toll. Eddie and Nolan followed close behind, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they struggled to keep up. The forest around them seemed to close in, the once familiar trees now towering over them like sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the dim moonlight. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that threatened to trip them with every step. But they didn't dare stop, not with the possibility that the creature might be following them, hunting them down one by one. As they ran, the humming that had filled the clearing earlier seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent, as if the very air was vibrating with the presence of the Flatwoods Monster. The boys exchanged panicked glances, their fear palpable, but none of them spoke. They couldn't risk slowing down, couldn't afford to think about what might happen if they were caught. Finally, they burst through the tree line, emerging onto a narrow path that wound its way down the mountain. The sight of the open sky above them, free from the oppressive canopy of the forest, brought a brief moment of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that they were still far from safety. The path was treacherous, with steep drops on either side, and the way down was long and winding. Edward paused, trying to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. But the night was silent, save for the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum that seemed to echo in his ears. He turned to his friends, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to keep moving. We have to get back to town, find help." Eddie nodded, his face pale and drawn. "What about Tommy?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared guilt. They all knew the truth, even if they couldn't bring themselves to say it. Tommy was gone, taken by something that defied explanation, and there was nothing they could do to save him. But before Edward could respond, the humming grew louder, filling the night with a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from all around them. The boys froze, their eyes wide with terror as they realized that the creature wasn't done with them yet. The air grew colder, the wind picking up as the trees around them swayed ominously, their branches creaking like old bones. A flash of light appeared on the path ahead, bright and blinding, and the boys instinctively shielded their eyes. The light was unnatural, a sickly green that cast eerie shadows on the ground, and it was getting closer. Edward's heart raced as he realized that they were trapped. The path behind them led back into the forest, where the creature had taken Tommy, and the way forward was blocked by the approaching light. Without thinking, Edward grabbed Eddie and Nolan by the arms, pulling them off the path and into the underbrush. "Hide," he hissed, his voice urgent. "We can't let it find us." The boys scrambled into the bushes, their bodies pressed close to the ground as they tried to make themselves as small as possible. The light grew brighter, the humming louder, until it felt like the very ground beneath them was vibrating. The boys held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the light passed by, illuminating the path just inches from where they were hiding. For a brief moment, they saw the creature again, its tall, metallic form gliding silently along the path, its glowing red eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of them. But it didn't stop, didn't seem to notice them hidden in the shadows. The light dimmed as the creature moved further down the path, and the humming began to fade, leaving the boys alone in the darkness once more. They waited, trembling with fear, until they were sure the creature was gone. Only then did they dare to move, slowly crawling out from their hiding place and back onto the path. The night was quiet again, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly as they realized they had escaped, at least for now. But the terror of what they had witnessed, and the loss of their friend, would stay with them forever. The Highlanders. The mountains had always held a certain allure for those seeking adventure and solitude. Majestic, ancient, and shrouded in mist, they called to the daring and the curious. For a group of 9 friends, the decision to embark on a trek through the remote highlands of the United States seemed like the perfect escape from the monotony of daily life. The trail promised breathtaking views, fresh air, and the thrill of the unknown. But as they ventured deeper into the mountains, they began to notice strange things: discarded clothing, abandoned shoes, and other remnants of past travelers. What started as a curious oddity quickly turned into a harrowing nightmare when they realized they were not alone. The Highlanders, a hidden group of mountain dwellers, had been watching them from the shadows. And soon, the friends would discover the horrifying truth about the people who lived deep within the mountains, people who needed more than just the isolation to survive. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the trail as the group of 9 made their way deeper into the mountains. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Laughter echoed off the rocks as they joked and shared stories, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The path was steep but manageable, winding through dense forests and past cascading streams that sparkled in the fading light. It wasn't long before they started noticing the first signs that something was off. It began with a lone hiking boot, old and weathered, lying in the middle of the trail. One of the group, a tall man named Jake, picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like someone lost their shoe," he said with a chuckle, tossing it aside. The others laughed it off, thinking nothing of it. But as they continued on, more items appeared: a torn jacket, a rusted canteen, a child's stuffed toy, all left behind as if abandoned in haste. The atmosphere began to shift, the earlier sense of adventure slowly giving way to unease. The forest, once full of life, seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of birds and insects fading into an eerie silence. The group exchanged uneasy glances but pressed on, determined to reach their campsite before dark. The trail narrowed as it led them higher up the mountain, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. As they rounded a bend, they came across something that made them stop in their tracks. Scattered across the path were clothes, shirts, pants, shoes, all in various states of decay. Some were torn, others stained with what looked like old blood. A chill ran through the group as they took in the scene, the air suddenly feeling much colder. "What the hell happened here?" whispered Emily, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. Jake, trying to keep the mood light, shrugged. Probably just some old campsite that got ransacked by animals, he suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. The others nodded, but the fear was palpable now, creeping into the back of their minds like a dark cloud. As they continued, the tension only grew. The path became more treacherous, the ground uneven and slippery with moss. The trees loomed closer, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that seemed to reach out toward the group. And then, just as they began to think they were imagining things, they saw them, glowing red eyes, peering out from the bushes on either side of the trail. At first, they dismissed it as wildlife, maybe coyotes or deer. But the eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at them with an unsettling intensity. One of the group, a woman named Sarah, pointed them out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see that?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. The others followed her gaze, their breaths catching as they realized they weren't alone. Panic began to set in as more eyes appeared, all around them, glowing in the dim light. They were surrounded, and yet, whatever was watching them made no move to attack. It was as if they were being studied, observed by something that didn't belong in this world. Jake took a step back, his hand reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. But as they turned to leave, they noticed something else, a faint, almost imperceptible movement in the distance. Hidden among the trees, half concealed by shadows, were what looked like doorways carved into the rock. Secret entrances that led deep into the mountain's heart. Before they could react, a sudden hissing sound filled the air, followed by the clinking of metal on stone. Smoke began to fill the air, acrid and choking. The last thing any of them saw before darkness overtook them were the figures emerging from the trees, dressed in military fatigues and gas masks, their eyes as red as the ones that had been watching them. The first thing Jake noticed when he woke up was the cold. It seeped into his bones, numbing his limbs and making it difficult to move. His head throbbed with pain, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. But as his senses slowly returned, the events of the previous night came rushing back. The trail, the eyes in the bushes, the smoke, it all hit him like a wave, and he bolted upright, his heart pounding with fear. The room he found himself in was dimly lit, the walls made of rough, uneven stone. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. Chains rattled as he moved, and Jake realized with a start that his hands were bound, heavy manacles securing him to the wall. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the restraints, but it was no use, the chains held fast, their metal biting into his wrists. He wasn't alone. Across the room, he could see the others, slumped against the walls, each of them bound in the same way. Emily was closest, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes fluttering as she slowly came to. Beyond her, Sarah and the others were still unconscious, their breaths shallow and uneven. The sight filled Jake with a sense of dread, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help them now. As Emily stirred, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around in confusion. When she saw Jake, her expression shifted from confusion to terror. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head, his voice low and tense. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here." The room was small, the only exit a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The walls were damp, water seeping through cracks in the stone and pooling on the floor. The air was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint sound of dripping water and distant, echoing footsteps. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, as if they were buried deep within the mountain, far from any hope of rescue. Before Jake could say anything else, the door creaked open, and the sound sent a jolt of fear through him. A figure stepped into the room, dressed in the same military fatigues and gas mask as the ones who had ambushed them. The mask obscured the figure's face, but Jake could see the faint red glow of eyes behind the tinted lenses, the same unsettling hue that had stared at them from the bushes. The figure moved with deliberate, mechanical precision, their boots echoing off the stone floor as they approached. They carried a small metal tray, the contents clinking ominously as they set it down on a table in the center of the room. Jake's blood ran cold as he caught a glimpse of what was on the tray: needles, scalpels, and other instruments, all meticulously arranged. Emily let out a small, terrified whimper as the figure turned to face them, their gaze lingering on each person in turn. The figure said nothing, just stood there, the red eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Then, without a word, they turned and left the room, the door slamming shut behind them with a finality that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. Who were these people? What did they want with them? The answers were elusive, buried deep within the stone walls that now held them captive. But one thing was clear: they were in grave danger. The red eyes, the instruments on the tray, the way the figure had moved, it all pointed to something dark and sinister, something that went beyond mere abduction. Jake's instincts screamed at him to find a way out, to escape before it was too late. But as he looked around the room, at the heavy chains that bound them, at the cold, unyielding stone walls, he realized that escape might not be an option. Emily's voice broke the silence, her words shaky. "What are they going to do to us?" Jake didn't have an answer, but the fear in her voice matched the terror that was clawing at his insides. Whatever the Highlanders were, whatever they wanted, Jake knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to let them go without a fight. The minutes that passed after the figure left felt like hours. The room was silent, except for the distant echoes that seemed to come from deep within the mountain. The fear that had settled in Jake's chest was now a living thing, gnawing at his resolve. He knew they didn't have much time. Whatever the Highlanders were planning, it was going to happen soon, and he needed to act before it was too late. Jake began to examine the chains that bound him. The manacles were old, rusted in places, but still strong enough to hold him. He tested the limits of the chains, pulling with all his might, but they didn't budge. His wrists ached, the metal cutting into his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The thought of what might happen if they stayed there any longer was enough to keep him going. Across the room, Emily was doing the same, her eyes wide with fear but determined. She met Jake's gaze, and in that moment, they both knew what they had to do. They couldn't wait for help. They had to help themselves. The others were starting to stir now, groaning as they slowly regained consciousness, and Jake knew they needed to move quickly. The Highlanders could return at any moment. Jake's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything they could use to their advantage. The table in the center of the room, with its array of terrifying instruments, was out of reach. But then, his gaze fell on a loose stone in the wall, just within arm's length. He stretched his hand as far as the chains would allow, his fingers brushing against the rough surface. With a grunt of effort, he managed to dislodge the stone, letting it fall to the ground with a dull thud. It wasn't much, but it was something. He picked up the stone, its edges jagged and sharp, and began to work on the manacles. The metal was tough, but the stone chipped away at it slowly. Sweat dripped down his face as he worked, every second feeling like an eternity. The others watched him, hope flickering in their eyes as they realized what he was trying to do. Finally, after what felt like forever, the manacle around his right wrist snapped open. Jake almost cried out in relief, but he forced himself to stay quiet. There was still the other wrist, and then there were the others to free. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. He switched the stone to his free hand and began working on the other manacle, his heart racing with urgency. It took less time than the first, and soon Jake was free. He quickly moved to Emily, working on her chains with the same determination. The fear in her eyes began to fade as the first manacle came loose, replaced by a steely resolve. They were going to get out of this. They had to. One by one, Jake freed the others, their expressions shifting from despair to determination. They were bruised, battered, and terrified, but they were alive, and now they had a chance. Jake motioned for them to stay quiet, listening intently for any sign of the Highlanders returning. The room remained silent, but the echoes still haunted the air, a constant reminder that they were deep within enemy territory. With everyone free, Jake led them to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He placed his ear against the wood, listening for movement on the other side. Nothing. He slowly pushed the door open, peering into the dimly lit corridor beyond. It was empty, the walls lined with the same rough stone, the air cold and stale. But it was their way out. Jake signaled for the others to follow, and they moved silently into the corridor, their footsteps barely making a sound. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant sound a harbinger of doom. But they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare before the Highlanders realized they were gone. The corridor twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the mountain. The air grew colder, and the silence more oppressive with each step. But then, in the distance, they saw it, a faint light, barely visible but enough to give them hope. Jake led the way, his breath quickening as they neared the light. It was a small crack in the stone, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Beyond it, they could see the night sky, stars twinkling in the darkness. They had found their way out. The 5 demons. HuaShan, one of China's most revered and treacherous mountains, looms large in the legends of the region. For centuries, its peaks have been both a symbol of spiritual ascent and a source of countless dark tales. Among those who seek to conquer its heights are the most experienced climbers, each driven by the allure of the unknown. For seasoned mountaineers, having already scaled the 4 other great peaks of China, set their sights on HuaShan, the final challenge. But unlike the others, this ascent would be different. They chose to climb at night, believing they were ready for anything. But what awaited them on those ancient slopes was beyond their worst nightmares. The demons that haunted HuaShan were not mere stories, they were real, and their hunger for lost souls was insatiable. The 4 climbers never returned, and their tale has since become a chilling legend, one that serves as a dire warning to all who dare to challenge the mountain after dark. The night air was crisp and cold as the 4 climbers, Li Wei, Zhang Rui, Chen Ming, and Fang Lan, prepared for their ascent of HuaShan. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie silver light over the rugged terrain. The group had faced many challenges before, but none felt as foreboding as this one. The path up HuaShan was known for its narrow trails, steep cliffs, and treacherous drops. Yet, the group's spirits were high, fueled by the excitement of conquering the last of China's great mountains. Li Wei, the most experienced of the group, led the way. His confidence was contagious, and the others followed without hesitation. The trail was steep from the start, the path winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around them as they climbed. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't long before the forest gave way to bare rock, the trees thinning out as they ascended higher. As they climbed, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The air grew colder, and the usual night sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by an unnatural silence. Fang Lan, the youngest of the group, felt a shiver run down her spine. She glanced over at Zhang Rui, who gave her a reassuring nod, but even he seemed on edge. The higher they climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the mountain itself was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The trail narrowed as they reached the first of HuaShan's infamous ledges, a thin strip of rock barely wide enough for one person to walk on. Below them, the ground dropped away into a black void, the bottom obscured by darkness. Li Wei went first, moving with the skill and precision of a seasoned climber. One by one, the others followed, their movements slow and cautious. Every step felt precarious, the rocks beneath their feet loose and crumbling. Halfway across the ledge, Chen Ming paused, his breath visible in the cold air. He felt something, a presence, something dark and ancient, lurking just beyond the edge of the cliff. He shook his head, trying to clear the unease from his mind, but the feeling only grew stronger. He looked back at the others, his eyes wide with fear. But before he could say anything, a gust of wind came out of nowhere, strong and sudden, nearly knocking him off balance. Fang Lan let out a small gasp, clutching the rock face as the wind howled around them. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now filled with dark clouds, obscuring the moon and plunging the trail into near total darkness. The wind carried with it a low, guttural sound, like distant voices whispering in a language none of them could understand. The temperature plummeted, and a deep sense of dread settled over the group. Li Wei, who had already reached the end of the ledge, turned back to help the others. But as he reached out to grab Chen Ming's hand, something else appeared on the trail, a figure, tall and shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It stood at the far end of the ledge, blocking their path, its presence radiating an aura of pure malevolence. Chen Ming froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure slowly advanced toward them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging the group to give in to their fear. The figure moved closer, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Li Wei shouted for the others to move, his voice breaking through the fog of terror that had settled over them. But it was too late. The figure lunged forward, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to engulf them. The cold that followed was unbearable, a freezing darkness that sucked the warmth and hope from their souls. The last thing Chen Ming saw before the darkness claimed him was the twisted, demonic face of the figure, its eyes burning with a hunger that would never be satisfied. The darkness was suffocating, as if the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. Li Wei struggled to keep his composure as the cold, shadowy tendrils coiled around him, sapping his strength. The figure with the burning eyes loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, and for the first time in his life, Li Wei felt truly powerless. The whispers that filled the air were no longer distant, they were inside his head, pressing against his thoughts, turning his fear into something tangible, something that could break him. Behind him, Zhang Rui and Fan Lan were also trapped in the nightmare. Zhang Rui had drawn his climbing pick, desperately slashing at the darkness that surrounded them, but it was no use. His strikes passed through the shadowy tendrils without effect, as if he were fighting the air itself. Fan Lan, trembling with fear, clung to the rock face, her eyes wide with terror as the figure drew nearer. She could feel its malevolence, a cold, ancient hatred that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. Chen Ming was gone. The thought hit them like a blow, but there was no time to grieve, no time to even process what had happened. The figure, this demonic entity, had taken him, and it was coming for them next. The ledge beneath their feet seemed to tremble, the rock groaning as if the mountain was awakening from a deep slumber, disturbed by their presence. Li Wei knew they had to move, had to escape before the darkness claimed them all. He forced himself to take a step forward, dragging his body through the freezing air that clung to him like a shroud. The figure's glowing eyes followed his every move, its shadowy form shifting, almost blending into the night, making it impossible to tell where the demon ended and the darkness began. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with images of despair and death. He saw visions of others who had climbed HuaShan, their souls trapped within the mountain, their bodies twisted and broken. The demons had taken them too, fed on their fear, their pain. And now they were coming for him, for Zhang Rui, for Fan Lan. There was no escape. But Li Wei refused to give in. With a burst of energy born from sheer desperation, he reached the end of the ledge, pulling Zhang Rui with him. Fan Lan was just behind, her breaths coming in ragged gasps as she fought against the shadows that clawed at her. The figure was right behind them, its glowing eyes burning into their backs as they scrambled onto the wider trail. They didn't stop running. The path ahead was treacherous, but they didn't care. The only thought in their minds was to get away, to put as much distance between themselves and the demon as possible. The mountain echoed with their footsteps, the sound almost lost in the howling wind that had risen out of nowhere. But the darkness was relentless, and the mountain was no longer just a place, it was a living thing, a monstrous entity that wanted them gone. As they ran, the trail twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of HuaShan. The trees, twisted and ancient, seemed to reach out for them with gnarled branches, and the rocks underfoot were slick with an otherworldly frost. The whispers followed them, never fading, always just on the edge of hearing, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Finally, they reached a clearing, a small plateau jutting out from the side of the mountain. The moon broke through the clouds for a brief moment, casting an eerie light over the scene. But the moment of relief was short-lived. As they looked around, they saw them, for more figures, standing at the edge of the clearing, their eyes glowing with the same sickly yellow light. The demons had been waiting for them. The figures moved as one, their forms shifting in the darkness, their bodies almost formless, like smoke given shape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that drowned out the wind. Li Wei, Zhang Rui, and Fan Lan knew they were surrounded, knew that this was the end. There was nowhere left to run. But the demons didn't attack. Instead, they stood there, their eyes locked onto the three climbers, as if savoring the fear that radiated from them. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and in that moment, the three climbers knew they were facing something far beyond their understanding. These were not just demons, they were the guardians of HuaShan, ancient spirits that had ruled the mountain long before humans ever set foot on its slopes. And now, they were claiming what was theirs. The realization that they were facing the guardians of HuaShan sent a wave of despair through Li Wei, Zhang Rui, and Fan Lan. The demons' eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, bore into them, stripping away any last vestiges of hope. The mountain had claimed countless souls over the centuries, and they were about to join them. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Li Wei's mind raced, searching for any possible escape, but the clearing was surrounded. The demons' forms were fluid, shifting and melding with the shadows, making it impossible to tell where one ended and another began. The whispers had turned into a cacophony of voices, each one a twisted echo of the last, filling the night with a chorus of madness. He knew they were trapped, but he couldn't bring himself to accept it. They had come so far, faced so many challenges, only to be stopped here, at the very brink of their final conquest. Zhang Rui stood beside him, his knuckles white as he gripped his climbing pick. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was a fire in his gaze, a determination not to go down without a fight. He glanced at Li Wei, and in that moment, they both knew what they had to do. If they were going to die, they would do so on their terms, fighting with everything they had left. Fan Lan, standing just behind them, felt the same resolve harden within her. She was terrified, more so than she had ever been in her life, but she wasn't going to let that fear consume her. Not yet. The demons might have the mountain on their side, but she still had her will, her strength. If this was the end, she would face it head-on. Li Wei was the first to move, charging toward the nearest demon with a shout that echoed across the clearing. The demon seemed almost amused as it watched him approach, its form twisting and elongating, becoming a mass of shadowy tendrils that lashed out at him. Li Wei dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack, and swung his ice axe with all his might. The blade passed through the demon's form as if through mist, the creature's shape flickering like a candle flame in the wind. But Li Wei didn't stop. He struck again and again, each blow more desperate than the last. The demon's laughter, a low, guttural sound, filled his ears, drowning out everything else. It was playing with him, toying with his last, futile attempts at resistance. The realization hit him like a physical blow, there was no defeating these things. They weren't creatures of flesh and blood, they were something else, something beyond human comprehension. Zhang Rui and Fan Lan were similarly engaged, each fighting their own battle against the other demons. Zhang Rui's strikes were precise, each one delivered with the skill of a seasoned climber, but it was no use. The demons simply reformed, their bodies flowing like liquid smoke, evading every attempt to harm them. Fan Lan, moving with the agility of a cat, managed to avoid the worst of the attacks, but she knew it was only a matter of time before her luck ran out. The demons began to close in, their forms becoming more solid, more defined, as if they were drawing strength from the climber's fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, each word a needle piercing their minds, unraveling their resolve. Li Wei could feel his strength waning, his movements becoming slower, more sluggish. The cold was creeping into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. And then, just as all seemed lost, a blinding light exploded from the center of the clearing. The demons recoiled, their forms flickering wildly as the light washed over them. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Li Wei, Zhang Rui, and Fan Lan shielded their eyes, blinded by the sudden brilliance. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The demons were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. The oppressive energy that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful calm. The three climbers stood there in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. But the mountain was not done with them yet. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, the rocks shifting and cracking as HuaShan itself seemed to awaken. The path back was no longer clear, the trail obscured by the shifting landscape. They had to move, had to find a way out before the mountain closed in around them. Li Wei led the way, his mind focused on one thing: survival. The others followed, their bodies bruised and battered, but their spirits unbroken. They scrambled down the mountain, the trail crumbling behind them, as if the mountain was trying to swallow them whole. The demons might have been driven back, but HuaShan was still a force to be reckoned with. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the base of the mountain. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the landscape. The horrors of the night seemed distant, almost unreal, but the memory of what they had faced would haunt them forever. They had survived HuaShan, but at a cost. Qinming was gone, claimed by the mountain, his fate sealed by forces beyond their control. As they looked back at the towering peaks of HuaShan, a chill ran down their spines. The mountain stood silent, unmoving, but they knew the truth. The demons of HuaShan were real, and they would be waiting for the next souls foolish enough to challenge them. As the darkness fades and the echoes of these terrifying tales linger, one thing is clear: the unknown is far more chilling than we ever imagined. Whether it's the cursed waters of Lake Louise, the monstrous shadows in the Appalachian Mountains, or the haunted peaks of HuaShan, each story reminds us that some places should remain untouched. But the question is, would you dare to venture into the unknown? If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves a good scare. And we want to hear from you. What's your scariest story? Drop it in the comments below. And of course, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale that will keep you up at night. Together, we'll explore the darkest corners of the world, and beyond.